This is a story that my grandmother told me. The story begins with a villager named Suzu. He was well known for being a gifted and precise hunter. He could kill any animal in his sight with a single shot. Suzu had more than 30 years of hunting experience. Every prey that was targeted by Suzu found it difficult to escape. Every time he went hunting in the mountains, he brought home a trophy. Sometimes it was small prey like rabbits, foxes and weasels, and other times it were much larger prey like deer and wild boar. At the same time, Suzu's wife gave birth to a lovely son named Kido. "The boy is as smart as his father," Suzu proclaimed. But the unfortunate thing was that as the child grew older, everyone realized he was a bit challenged. The village children of Kido's age refused to play with him because they thought Kido was stupid. But as the boy's parents, Suzu and his wife adored him, even if he was a bit dumpy, as the others would say. He was still their child. Sometimes, when they couldn't sleep in the middle of the night, they talk about their struggling son and plan ways to improve his future. But what they worried about that day and night was who would be able to care for Kido after they died. It was rumored that Suzu had killed too many lives over the years, so naturally vengeance was handed out to their family. That was why Suzu finally decided to put the shotgun away and stop hunting. 20 years later, when Suzu decided to return to a more honorable way of doing business, making a living by being an honest farmer, Kido was nearly 30 years old. The elderly couple died in turn, their only regret being that they were unable to help provide a family for Kido. So, after Suzu and his wife died, Kido was alone in the world. Even though Kido was 30 years old at that time, he couldn't take care of himself, not even for a meal. He was able to avoid starvation thanks to the generosity of his neighbors. Since then, the Lee family's kitchen had been ice cold. During that cold winter, snow fell for a long time and became increasingly dense, making travel difficult and food scarce. Kido became seriously ill because he lacked warm clothing at the time. Neighbors couldn't even take care of him at that period. Days passed when there was a knock on the door. A woman's silhouette appeared, carrying a rattan basket. It was a beautiful woman. She stated that she knew Suzu's father and had been asked to come here to care for him. Her name was Yon. The first thing Yon did when she came in was to prepare porridge for Kido. Her presence made the house feel cozier. Finally saved, only 2 days later, thanks to her dedicated care, his illness was completely cured only 2 days later. Yon had stayed at Kido's house since then, washing, cooking and caring for the special young man on a daily basis. In the countryside, stories like this quickly spread around every corner, becoming the topic of conversation among neighbors in their spare time. Many people were happy for Kido because now he had someone who could look after him. However, many people speculated about Yon's unusual appearance. The majority of people thought it was a good predestined relationship. Kido was silly, but in return he had honesty and good working ability, and Yon was a girl who was both beautiful and responsible. In the second year following Yon's arrival in the Lee family, everyone in the village took the place of Kido's parents to assist him in organizing a simple wedding ceremony for him and Yon. Everyone was happy for Kido. Before, no one ever imagined that one day he would have a wife, especially such a beautiful bride. The newlyweds' happy days passed peacefully in this manner, but then something tragic happened one day. That day, Kido went to the fields with his tool as usual. There was a group of young gangsters in the village who had been keeping a close eye on Kido and Yon for quite some time. In the past, they frequently took advantage of Kido's lack of intelligence to play tricks on him and make fun of him. But now, seeing a stupid person like him marrying such a beautiful wife, they were jealous. They were so jealous that their eyes turned red. But what else could they do since Kido and Yon was already married? "Throw pearls to the pigs," they said bitterly. But, come what may, when jealousy was at its peak, taking advantage of the fact that Kido had left the house, they had bad intentions for Yon right away. They all went to Kido's house because they knew Yon was alone at home right at that moment. At the same time, Yon was hanging clothes in the yard. Hearing the knock on the door, she thought that the neighbors had something to ask for as usual, and besides, it was daylight, so she didn't take any precautions. Yon was wary as soon as the door was ajar and she saw the three men. But now they were using the excuse of bringing an injured Kido home to persuade her to open the door. The door swung open. Outside, there was no injured Kido, despite what they claimed. Instead, only the three thugs with despicable faces. "Hello, beautiful." Yon quickly realized she was in a dangerous situation. One of them took a step forward and grabbed her wrist. After barbaric laughter, they proudly dragged her inside. Yon was dragged away involuntarily because her strength couldn't be compared to three adult men. Yon screamed angrily and held Kido's name in terror. Meanwhile, Kido was working in the field. Suddenly, his tool's handle snapped, as if by premonition. Despite his lower intelligence, he had a vague sense that something was wrong, and he felt unusual discomfort in his heart. All he could think about was Yon, his wife. Kido dashed home immediately without much thought. Despite Yon's frantic resistance, the three thugs successfully forced her to lie on the bed inside the house after a long struggle. Yon's face changed abnormally while she was struggling with despair. Patches of brick-colored hair gradually appeared on both sides of her face, and her teeth sharpened as well. The thugs had noticed the anomaly as well. They appeared terrified, but it was all too late. When Yon waved her hand, one of the thugs' faces appeared splattered with blood and covered with deep scratches. In front of them was now a fox. Terrified, the other two thugs fled. Outside, Kido also just returned. When he saw someone fleeing from his house, he knew they had gotten into trouble with Yon. Kido might not be very smart, but he had tremendous strength. In a fit of rage, he swung up and smacked the thug in the middle of the forehead, who died instantly on the spot, in a pool of his own blood. He witnessed a horrifying scene as soon as he ran into the house. Yon was launching an attack on one of the other two thugs. He became completely immobile. Hearing the sounds, Yon turned around, blood still stuck to the corner of her mouth on her fox-transformed face. Yon calmed down as she saw the person approaching was Kido. Her face, as usual, changed back into a beautiful appearance instantly. But strangely, Kido was not afraid of his wife's appearance. He trusted her because he knew she wouldn't hurt him. The injured thug recovered after being terrified by Yon's transformation. He grabbed his face and bolted as fast as he could, yelling aloud that there was a demon inside the house. Yon was unconcerned about the last surviving thug. She asked Kido to bring the bodies of the other two into the house. She finished the job and sat cross-legged on the bed facing the two corpses. In the meantime, a faint blue light emanated from both of her hands. Kido sat to one side, intently watching his wife's movements. The two blue lights in her hands slowly flew forward, landing one after the other on top of the corpses. It was magic. The two thugs leaped to their feet as soon as the blue light vanished. They somehow came back to life. Kido was taken aback. How could the dead be brought back to life? Yon, on the other hand, explained that they had been resurrected, but were no longer human. She purposefully implanted two souls of both a cat and a dog into their bodies. Yon began telling Kido everything. In fact, she was a fox fairy who, out of gratitude, incarnated in human form to care for Kido. Yon's grandmother was saved by his father Suzu during a hunting trip 20 years ago. She was caught in an animal trap set by other hunters at the time. In return for Suzu's kindness, Yon's grandmother asked her to take care of his son after he died. As for the escaped thug, he went everywhere since that day to tell everyone that Yon was some kind of a demon, but sadly, no one believed him. Everyone thought he was insane. The other two didn't fare much better. One guy was always climbing up the walls to lie on and bask in the sun like a cat, while another guy specialized in rummaging through trash cans everywhere looking for leftovers like a dog. Time continued in this manner until Kido finally passed away at the age of 51. Yon was in charge of his funeral and burial arrangements. She then shut the door and began walking down the road towards the mountain. Yon left with a rattan basket in her hand, just like the day she went to Kido's house that cold winter. Many people said she hadn't aged at all after living with Kido for so long. As a result, they gradually began to believe the thug's words, believing that she was indeed a transforming fox elf. This is a true horror story that's well known in my hometown. At the time, there was a couple in my village who lived with their younger brother. One day, a man from the village dashed to their house and knocked on the door. The man was panicking, dashing inside and howled, "Dead! Your brother is dead!" The older brother was mortified, unable to believe what he had heard, and repeatedly asked the man to please correct himself. But this man insisted that his brother was hunting with him when he slipped and fell into a stream. The older brother and his wife were astounded to hear this. As a result, the two followed the man and hurried to the forest's edge to check on his brother's situation. When they arrived, they noticed that there were many people standing around. Everyone was talking about the accident. At the time, it was extremely difficult for the couple to get through the crowd to see how their brother was doing. On the spot, his brother was soaking wet, pale and motionless on the ground, but his eyes were still open and dreamy, staring at the couple as if clinging to life. When the couple noticed this, they rushed to assist their younger brother. The older brother pressed his ear to his brother's heartbeat hopelessly, seeing that he was still alive. Thinking that there was still a chance to save his life, the older brother and his wife brought him home. The house was now filled with the cries of the wife and the younger brother, who was now lying motionless on the bed. The couple's worry and grief were clearly visible on each person's face. All they had to do now was wait for him to take his last breath. However, a wheezing sound came from his mouth at that moment. The couple was taken aback by the expression. The couple had just turned to look at their brother when he sat up like a spring, but this time his face was very frightening and his eyes were lifeless. When the wife noticed that her brother was awake, she couldn't contain her joy and cried and called him, but he didn't answer and just sat with his back to the couple, looking very strange. Immediately after that, he crawled onto the bed and stood up awkwardly, squirming like a zombie. He walked like a child learning how to walk, his mouth still smiling with a devilish grin. But then he collapsed back on the bed. When the wife saw her brother like that, she assumed he had just drowned, so he was tired, dizzy, and couldn't stand. Concerned for his safety, she immediately ran to help him, but when she got close to him, she felt a cold from the younger brother's body. As soon as she touched his body, the younger brother turned to face his older brother and sister-in-law with a strange expression. He had a crazy smile on his face. His eyes were white and his irises were cloudy. He looked insane. After that, the younger brother jumped to the ground from the bed with all his legs and arms and ran out of the room as fast as an arrow. He dashed out, aiming for the door. The couple looked at him in surprise, not sure if it was because he was shocked by drowning and wondering where he could run to. Concerned about their brother, the couple decided to go out and find him. They both looked around the corner and called out their brother's name, but there was no response. After searching for a while, the husband discovered his brother in a garden corner performing a terrifying action. He sat in front of the chicken coop door before reaching inside and catching a large rooster. His next move surprised and shocked the couple. His mouth only smiled satisfiedly before he bared his teeth, grabbed the rooster hard and sucked its blood. Seeing his brother's scary expression, the couple rushed to hold him, but at the same time, he seemed to have become insane and difficult to control. When the husband noticed this, he stopped him, but he struggled, as if he wanted to get out. The husband, who was no longer strong enough to stop him, had to rely on his wife's assistance to bring him into the house. As if sensing something, the husband quickly wrapped a blanket around his body and tied him up with ropes. He hummed angrily like an animal, not saying anything. The wife suspected that their brother had gone insane after falling into the stream. When the wife discovered that her brother was behaving strangely, she was taken aback and questioned her husband, who showed a cold demeanor. Suddenly, the two were drawn to a strange phenomenon from their younger brother, which made them extremely scared. In front of them was no longer the usual gentle little brother, but a scary demon. His face changed dramatically, turning monstrous. His eyes turned blue and he grumbled like a demon. Because the husband knew his judgment was correct, he told his wife to stay at home to watch over his brother, while he ran to the next village to invite the shaman over to do an exorcism. Later, the husband and the shaman, who was known as the best shaman in the area, arrived at the house. The wife was standing outside and she said that she dare not go inside because he would go insane whenever he saw someone. With a thoughtful expression on his face after hearing the wife's explanation, the teacher went to observe the younger brother's situation. The husband was concerned and he was a little impatient to ask the shaman, but the shaman simply stated that his brother had died. When the wife heard it, she couldn't believe it. Why was her brother still able to move when he's dead? The shaman then asked the couple if they had recently seen a golden ferret around the house, which surprised him. After thinking for a while, the couple told the shaman that their brother had caught and killed a stray golden ferret in the yard last week. As soon as the shaman heard this, he asked the couple to bring him a pair of scissors. The wife immediately did as she was told. The husband then followed what the shaman told him, assisted his brother to stand up, and watched the shaman gently walk away to perform the spell. When confronted with the shaman, the younger brother was now screaming like a maniac. The shaman held the scissors in front of him and muttered an exorcism spell. Hearing the shaman's voice, the younger brother became more aggressive, turning around and shouting, baring his teeth to threaten the man. The strangest thing was that the younger brother did not speak any human language but only called out in unknown voices. Seeing this, the shaman became enraged and howled angrily, "If you don't go, I will cut off your tail." He was now struggling and screaming, making it difficult for the older brother to hold him. After that, as soon as the shaman finished the spell, he grabbed something invisible in the air and cut it in front of the couple with his scissors. As soon as the action ended, the younger brother groaned as if he was in pain. Following that, his entire body trembled, his face turned purple, but his eyes were gentle and calm. After that, the younger brother writhed in agony. After a while of shaking, he stopped moaning but fell to the ground. The couple saw this, immediately ran to him, but the younger brother was lying motionless. His body was cold, and he didn't wake up. Witnessing that scene, the shaman announced with a sad voice that the young brother was gone. Then he quietly left. Both husband and wife burst into tears as they looked at the cold corpse. His brother's funeral was held in an uncomplicated manner. But ever since, there had been a golden ferret with its tail missing, running back and forth in front of the couple's house. The ghost wedding was a type of marriage ceremony of the afterlife which appeared before the Han Dynasty in China. It was the betrothal of an unmarried person to a deceased person as husband or wife. In my village in the 90s, I heard a story related to this ghost wedding. In the village, there was a girl named Fang. Fang had an older brother. Because of her family's poverty, her mother married her to a dead man to get money for her brother's marriage. Their family was wealthy, but they only had one son, Sin. Sin had been sick since childhood. A monk said that Sin would not live to be 20. Sin lived to be 25, but his condition worsened shortly after his birthday. He went to many doctors, but they all refused to treat him. Then Sin passed away. But he was not buried. His parents bought a girl to have a wedding with him. The chosen one was Fang. But ever since Fang married Sin, strange things kept happening. The day Fang's wedding took place, no one attended because Sin's parents didn't want many people to know. After performing strange rituals in the church room, it was already dark. Then Sin's parents took Fang to Sin's room and went out. After a long wedding day, Fang felt tired. She took off her wedding dress, lay on the bed and fell asleep. In her sleep, Fang suddenly felt like someone was around her. A cold hand was touching her. Fang was awakened by that cold hand. When she opened her eyes, she saw a man sitting by the bed. She felt that the man was very familiar, but she couldn't remember. The man suddenly said, "Don't be surprised. I am Sin. You are my wife now." Fang heard the man say that. In her heart, she did not believe, because how could Sin come back to life? Sin looked at Fang and flashed a ghostly smile. He said, "Of course I am dead, and now I am just a soul." At this moment, Fang saw the altar picture behind Sin. The man in front of her was exactly like the person in the photo. She couldn't believe they were the same person. That made Fang only have one thought in her mind, that he was a ghost. Fang screamed and fainted. Early in the next morning, Fang woke up feeling aching all over her body. She saw the blood on the bed and remembered what happened last night. She thought someone had faked Sin and tricked her into losing her virginity, because how could the dead come back to life? After thinking about it, she dared not tell her husband's parents that she had been tricked into losing her virginity on the first day of marriage. Because if this got out, she didn't know how she would live. Her husband's family was very good to her. Every day they all nourished her. Fang didn't have to do any work because they were afraid she would get tired. But the better they treated her, the more guilty she felt. So, it had been more than 4 months since Fang got married and stayed in their house since Sin passed away. Fang was more and more scared because her belly was getting bigger and bigger. She didn't know how to explain it. But when they saw Fang's belly, they were not only not angry, on the contrary, they were very happy. Fang turned from fear to curiosity. One day after having dinner, Fang felt so bored. Therefore, she walked around the house alone. As she reached the corner of the street, she saw 2 women talking. When Fang heard them talk about her, she hid against a wall and listened to the story. It turned out that Fang's strange marriage and a pregnant belly had become the matter of discussion. Fang felt very uncomfortable hearing them talk about her. Fang was sad when the 2 women talked about her growing belly. They said that it was most likely a ghost fetus. Fang was horrified to hear this. She didn't know and didn't understand what a ghost fetus was. Suddenly, she remembered the scene on the first night of marriage. Was it really Sin that came back that night? Fang did not dare to listen to the story of those 2 women anymore. She desperately walked home and was so scared that she didn't know what she was carrying. Fang returned home, her heart heavy. She didn't pay attention to the greetings of her husband's parents and went straight to her room. Then she climbed right into bed and fell into a deep sleep. While fast asleep, Fang heard the door creak from outside. A cold wind rushed in and Fang was startled awake. She sat up and looked at the door. At this moment, Fang could see clearly that a shadow had come in front of her. Fang saw the shadow that was Sin, her dead husband. Fang heard Sin's confession about himself. With more anxiety in her heart than fear, Sin was not as fierce as before and very polite. He stood by the bed and kept his distance from Fang, but Fang felt many doubts. Fang still didn't believe Sin was dead. Sin turned to go to the window and began to tell the story. Sin had been sick since childhood. The family sought many remedies, many healers to cure him, but to no avail. When Sin was 15 years old, a man claiming to be a monk could help him continue his life by following the monk to study religion. Sin's parents loved him very much, but because they wanted Sin to live a few more days, they let him follow the monk. Time flew. 3 years had passed in the blink of an eye. Sin's parents were very worried and always waited for his return. Suddenly one day Sin returned. The couple was happy to see him. However, no matter what his parents asked Sin, he did not tell them where he had gone during those years. After that, Sin passed his 20th birthday. His parents were happy to see that his face was rosier than before, but Sin had very strange expressions. His father saw that Sin was not happy. He was worried about Sin's illness, so he asked. When Sin said that he would not live to 25 years old, his father immediately felt worried. Sin looked at his father as if remembering something. He began to explain to his father. The old monk helped him improve his physical strength, but it was limited to 25 years old. The monk said when Sin was over 25 years old, he would die. Sin had hoped that when he died, his parents could find someone to marry him. If the wife agreed to enter the wedding chamber within the first 7 days, she would give birth to a son for his family. When Fang heard this, she was completely dumbfounded. It turned out that Sin was a ghost. He didn't lie to her. Fang picked up the pillow and threw it at Sin, but the pillow passed through Sin's body. Sin was not angry but happy to tell Fang his true purpose. Sin wanted to use the ghost fetus in Fang's belly so that he could be reincarnated as a human. At this moment, the door was kicked open. Fang and Sin simultaneously looked towards the door. It was the old monk. At that time, Sin stopped studying and returned because he couldn't stand the hardship. However, he had stumbled across the resurrection method in the monk's room. When he saw Fang's stomach, the monk understood what had happened and was very angry. According to Sin, the monk did not want to save him because the monk did not tell him about this method. Meanwhile, The monk knew that Sin's heart was not good, so he soon lost his way. Sin didn't believe in the old monk. He thought the monk had a good method, why not show him early? Knowing that Sin couldn't be stopped, the old monk was determined to destroy Sin's ghost to save Fang. The monk drew a spell in the air and pushed towards Sin. Sin tried to escape, but he found his legs couldn't move. Sin saw 4 small ghosts appear on him. They held Sin so he couldn't move. At this moment, the old monk walked towards Sin, took out a piece of charm paper and stuck it on his forehead. Seeing black smoke on his head, Sin was very scared in his heart. The old monk went to Fang. He wanted to save her before the ghost fetus was completely formed. Fang felt very scared now, and without consulting her, the monk took out a piece of charm paper, mumbling something. After reciting the spell, the talisman in the monk's hand also spontaneously caught fire. Then the monk said a sentence. The bowl of water on the table flew into his hand. The old monk stuffed the talisman paper into the bowl. The water in the bowl caught fire. Fang was afraid and covered her eyes. When the fire was extinguished, the water in the bowl turned red. The monk said that if Fang just drank this bowl of water, the ghost fetus in her belly would be destroyed. Fang fainted on the bed after drinking the bowl of water, and a black liquid came out from Fang's lower part. At this time, the monk looked back at Sin. Sin was weak and fading. He angrily cursed at the monk. The old man walked towards Sin, holding a wooden sword in his hand as if he wanted to finish Sin directly. At this time, Sin's mother heard and rushed to intervene. When the monk did not notice, a mother's hand suddenly snatched the talisman from Sin's forehead. As soon as the energy that suppressed him disappeared, Sin turned into a gust of wind and fled. The monk knew that Sin's mother loved Sin very much, so even though he was enraged, the old monk still ignored it, and then he left without looking back. Sin's father and mother looked at the door, crying until their tears ran dry. They knew it was wrong to love their son that way and felt sorry for their son and sorry for Fang. The next day, Sin's parents moved away with Fang. No one knew where they went, but everyone noticed that Fang's belly wasn't that big anymore. This was a strange story of an office worker named Sam. He was the sales manager for a small office in the city center. Recently, Sam was preparing a business plan to present to his superiors. For him, this was an important step in his career, helping him to advance. As of today, it had been a week since he worked overtime. There didn't seem to be a day when he didn't come home late. When the whole office had left, Sam remained alone to continue working. He tiredly looked at the words running in front of the computer desk and then lazily, helplessly leaned back in his chair, looked up at the light bulb on the ceiling with his lethargic dark eyes from lack of sleep. Sam stretched and turned to look at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. The work seemed to be almost finished. Sam saw that, so he got up and quickly put on his coat. He put aside work for a while and went out of the office. He walked alone under the streetlights flickering on the street. As he walked, he thought about his life. After a while, suddenly his stomach rumbled. He suddenly remembered all day, because he was so focused, he still hadn't eaten anything. He turned into an alley. At the end of the street was a 24-hour convenience store. How unlucky. Today, his familiar shop was closed again. The whole street was pitch black. There was only one crepe cart at the end of the street. Sam was attracted to this crepe cart. He was surprised to see the old cart placed in the dark corner. This was the first time he saw the crepe cart placed here. He breathed a sigh of relief. At least there was still a food cart for sale. He comfortably walked in front of the crepe cart, calling the seller. He waited for a while, and an old woman with a hunchback came out from the crepe cart, telling him that there was only one left. He nodded in agreement. After that, the old woman used her slow movements to make cakes for him. Looking at the old woman, he also knew that he couldn't ask for more. While making cakes, the old woman asked about his life. Sam also happily answered her. He told her about his job and the reason for coming home from work later today. He stood looking at the skillful operation of the old woman making cakes in front of his eyes, with a little interest and attraction in his heart. She poured the cake batter into the pan, coated it with a smooth layer. Her movements were very skillful, looked very pleasing to the eye. The aroma of the cake wafted up, swished across Sam's nose. He smelled the aroma in his heart, anticipating how delicious this cake was. His hand was on his stomach as if to stop the hunger that was screaming inside. While waiting, he also curiously asked the old woman why her children and grandchildren would let her stand selling this late at night alone. She smiled sadly and told him that she had no children. After that, she gave him a still, hot, fragrant crepe with a gentle and kind attitude. He politely took the cake from her hand, smiled, and happily paid. She received a large amount of money from Sam's hand, a little confused in her heart, seeing that Sam also smiled kindly at her, and gave her the change and then left. Sam could not contain his hunger, so he took a big bite of the cake, feeling the relief and relaxation in his heart. Then he turned back towards the crepe cart as if to send the old woman a compliment about the taste of the cake. But when he turned around, he was completely amazed. In front of him was a dark space. The old woman and the crepe cart also suddenly disappeared for unknown reasons, as if no one had ever sold cakes here. Sam saw this, very surprised. He ran into the alley to see where the old woman could go so quickly, but when he got there he couldn't believe his eyes. In front of him appeared a dead-end alley with no way out. At the end of the alley were litter and garbage bags. There was no sign where the old lady had gone. He found it difficult to understand how could the old woman go so fast. So he took the crepe cake in his hand, seeing it still didn't disappear, so he sure didn't see a ghost. He took a big bite. It was surprisingly delicious, not like a cake made by the devil. Sam devoured the cake in his hand and thought about the strange thing he just encountered. Then Sam also left to go home because it was already late at night. He still couldn't stop thinking about what just happened. The next day he woke up in his room. Yesterday's story about the old woman didn't matter to him anymore. He changed his clothes and hurried on his way. As he walked, he found himself daydreaming strangely about the craving he had for the taste of yesterday's cake. So he turned into a familiar alley to go to the old woman who sold him cakes last night. But for some reason this morning he did not see the old lady. Instead, the old woman's cake selling place had an old man sitting there selling corn. He looked old. Sam walked over to ask the old man a few questions. He pointed to the place where the old woman's crepe cart was, asking the old man about the whereabouts of that old woman selling crepes. The old man was surprised to ask who Sam was. Why did he go looking for the old woman? So Sam told the old man how he had met her last night. After hearing this, the old man became more and more alarmed, coldly said to Sam in a firm voice, "She passed away a long time ago." Sam couldn't believe what he heard anymore, looking at the old man in amazement. Seeing that the old man also invited Sam to sit down and tell him the story about the old woman. No one here knew that old woman. She had sold crepes here when he was young. At that time, the old woman sold cakes at the head of the street. The taste of her cakes were very delicious. It seemed that there was not a day that was not crowded in front of the crepe stall. The workers, no matter how far away, once they had eaten her cake, they had to come back again. Everyone who finished eating her cake could hear her talk and care, so the atmosphere around her cake was always full of laughter and joy. She sold from early morning until late at night. Her house was located quite far from here. After selling, she often rode home alone. No one knew where her children were. People only knew that she lived alone. She lived with a bunch of kids who didn't know if they were her grandchildren or the street kids she adopted. Every time she came home, she would bring home crepes for them. For a bunch of kids, it was the most precious gift in the world. The children received crepes from the old woman and happily shared them with each other. For her, watching them eat and drink was the greatest happiness. But that day was different from the other day. Looking at the children happily eating and playing with each other, she suddenly felt a little sad and insecure in her heart. She quietly told these children all that was necessary and said everything she wanted to say, and to say goodbye. The children heard her say that and immediately bursted into tears. They ran to hug her as if to keep her with them, not letting her leave. The scene that day made many people who witnessed it also moved to the point of pain. The next morning, whatever came would happen. Her regular customers came to her crepe cart as usual to buy cakes. The cart that day was still in the old place, but they called and she didn't answer. Everyone was curious. They went over to take a look and saw that the old woman was sitting on the ground motionless, stiff, not responding to customers like before. They frantically asked each other about the old woman's situation, worried about how she was. One of the people in the crowd looked at her and quickly called a few others to help. Everyone saw that the situation seemed serious, so they ran from the outside to check it out. Everyone looked at her in panic. The old woman was sitting curled up on the ground as usual, but this time her face was pale and stiff, and she was no longer breathing. As he spoke, the old man sadly recalled the past. He regretted when her crepe cart was no more. After listening, Sam also knew what happened last night. As he expected, he met a ghost, but only because she wanted to sell cakes. After knowing the end of the story, Sam said goodbye to the old man and continued on his way to the office, temporarily putting aside the story about the old crepe-selling lady. One day, Mr. Chow was relatively free because there were no recent serious cases, therefore he had time to check some other case files. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise outside the corridor and he assumed that something was happening outside. He stepped out to investigate and he noticed two policemen escorting a tall, rugged-looking man. But both the policemen appeared to be having difficulty to control the man since the man looked to be quite muscular and furious. In fact, the man was capable of effortlessly knocking down a police officer with a little strike. Then the man used a slight yank of his arm to knock down the second officer. At the time, Mr. Chow was still monitoring things. The one policeman said that the man was arrested for attacking others in public. And just as the man was about to run away, he looked like a tiger. He was tall and extremely agile. However, as the man passed Mr. Chow only needed to use one attack to block the man. Mr. Chow threw the man more than a meter away where the man was detained by other officers. At the time, Mr. Chow and the man were face to face. Mr. Chow couldn't believe this man to be a nasty person. Mr. Yang, on the other hand, said that the man had seriously injured a large number of people on the street. Mr. Chow was surprised. He had no idea why the man attacked so many people. He was curious about this man. Despite Mr. Chow's questioning, the policeman said that the case was within his scope, so he did not want Mr. Chow to interfere. He claimed that the case was nothing more than a fight between opposing street gangs. For no reason, Mr. Chow felt that the case was not so simple. He was very curious about the man, so he invited Mr. Yang into his room to drink tea and talk. Mr. Yang saw the curiosity and enthusiasm of Mr. Chow. He didn't want to conceal secrets any longer, so he told Mr. Chow everything that happened on that morning. At the area of manager Mr. Yang, there were a lot of children sitting outside begging for food recently, and one of them was a child who lost both legs. The child was terribly sick. He had lost 2 legs and frequently sat next to the large wall and asked visitors for money. According to the man, he saw that the child was robbed from all his belongings and money from some guy. Therefore, the man went over to confront the thief, but he wasn't in the mood to answer any of it. So the thief said insulting things and told the man to get out of the way. But the man disagreed and asked the guy to pay the child back. In the end, the thief got angry and called out a few gang members to threaten him. They started cursing and threatening him. Then they wanted to teach him a lesson. They believed it would be simple to overpower this man. But this was no ordinary man. He was able to defeat the thugs with just a few hits. He proceeded to knock them out one by one. But in any case, he was outnumbered, which prevented his escape and ended up with him being assaulted and harmed by the pack of thugs. Even though he was restrained, he could still resist fiercely. The man was as fierce and tenacious as a tiger. The man used all means possible, from striking to biting, as he just simply refused to give up. After that, despite being injured himself, he defeated them all. Until the police arrived, he continued to beat them with no intention of stopping. The police had to try their best to prevent him from continuing the fight, after which they brought him to the headquarters. After hearing everything, Mr. Chow asked Mr. Yang if he could handle the case. Mr. Yang also said that they had seen beggars seemingly forced by a group of people, but they weren't able to investigate the location just yet. When the fight happened, Mr. Yang was afraid he would break cover and get attention from them, which could possibly make them change to another site to operate from. So the police temporarily arrested the man, and Mr. Yang also agreed that Mr. Chow investigate this case, because this neighborhood also had many other cases to deal with. After being authorized, Mr. Chow immediately went to see the big man. Mr. Chow brought him some food, and he made it clear to him that he had no bad intentions and that the police had no intention of accusing him of being a criminal. And because Mr. Chow admired the man's calm demeanor, he agreed to let him go. The man was Mr. Shen. While he was eating, he told Mr. Chow that he did not simply meet that poor child by chance. He had repeatedly dreamt of a strange child, and in his dream, the child urged him to go via a certain route to help his friends. And eventually, when he got there, he saw the other person taking advantage of the child to ask for money, so he intervened. When Mr. Chow heard this, he offered to help him with the investigation of this case, and they could accompany each other. Mr. Shen was extremely surprised and happy to hear this. He told Mr. Chow about his dream. In his dream, he saw a little boy. The boy was looking very vague, but behind him was a row of houses looking very old and shabby. There was a very large and tall brick chimney next to the row of houses. After Mr. Shen shared the details of his dream, Mr. Chow immediately thought about the place with the chimneys as described. After Mr. Shen had eaten his fill, he began to speak his mind, because he grew up in the working class area, so he also knew many places like the areas in his dream. Both of them began to discuss and come up with their own theories about what was involved with the case and the dream. Mr. Chow invited Mr. Chen to accompany him to the locations they had just discussed. Although he was surprised that a police officer requested that he go with him to investigate the case, Mr. Shen did not think much about it because of the children. They mattered to him. He was thinking this as they began to drive to various locations. Along the way, both were very focused to find the place with the chimney. Suddenly, Mr. Shen recognized something familiar because the place in his dream was, of course, hazy and impossible to distinguish. This familiar place was a row of old houses built with clay bricks and had a tall chimney also made from old bricks. Their car soon arrived in front of the block, and Mr. Shen was also puzzled. But the closer he got, the clearer his memory became. The place looked exactly like in his dream. Mr. Shen hurriedly shouted for Mr. Chow to quickly stop. If they wanted to get to those houses, they needed to drive around a tall, dense lawn. Because the place was originally an abandoned area for a long time, it might be risky. As soon as the car stopped, Mr. Shen rushed out of the car and ran to the place he remembered from his dream. Mr. Shen seemed to not have time to explain clearly to Mr. Chow, as Mr. Shen suddenly rushed in. At that time, Mr. Chow also understood the situation, so he did not stop him. Mr. Chow chased after Mr. Shen towards the old houses. They were very quick to get to the exact location. The area was a row of houses built one after the other. They were very old houses, but all were uninhabited. They went around to investigate and discovered a suspicious man in front of an old house hidden behind the blocks. But as soon as he noticed someone coming, he hurriedly went inside and closed the door. Mr. Chow stopped Mr. Shen so that he didn't move, otherwise the enemy might run away. Finally, they discussed a plan to lure the enemy out of the lair in the safest way. Mr. Shen would ring the door to lure the guard out, while Mr. Chow would try to enter from another direction. Immediately, the guard had taken out his knife. He suddenly attacked from the inside. They were clearly hiding something. But with his agility, Mr. Shen quickly dodged the attack. When Mr. Shen was about to counterattack, Mr. Chow pushed down the guard from behind. Mr. Chow jumped over the wall and got into the yard as he helped Mr. Shen defeat the guy. Mr. Chow said the outside was under control as they quickly checked inside. They approached the courtyard, where they discovered an exceedingly ancient home full of chains. The door was locked from the outside, but the crying and groaning could still be heard from the inside. Mr. Shen used his remarkable strength to break through the door. The light flooded the dark room inside. At the point, Mr. Shen and Mr. Chow were both taken back by what they saw. Multiple children filled the house, all pale and dressed in filthy clothes, huddling on the floor with no blankets, and there was just a small amount of leftover food and water on the ground nearby. They must have been imprisoned here for a long time, since their expressions were filled with terror. The food was thrown on the ground. They had just a few potatoes and a little water, and they were all barefoot and covered with wounds. Mr. Chow calmed the children, and he told them that he was a policeman and they would all be saved. Mr. Shen went around the house to inspect. Suddenly he shouted to the surprise of Mr. Chow. Mr. Chow rushed to see what the situation was as he saw Mr. Shen holding a baby in his arms, a baby who appeared to have 2 broken legs. According to the children, the child was beaten, breaking both legs, and was often taken to the street to use for begging. But he never went to the hospital, and these days he slept for a long time without waking up. Mr. Chow immediately advised Mr. Shen that the child needed to be taken to the hospital for treatment since he didn't appear to be conscious enough. Mr. Chow and Mr. Shen hurriedly gathered all of the children and exited the home to get into the car. They took all the children to the hospital for a general checkup. Some children were almost exclusively malnourished and lacking in nutrients, but only the one with the broken legs was seriously injured. Mr. Shen saw this very child in his dream because it was now evident that the child was going to die and probably reached out in his dreams for help. Mr. Chow comforted Mr. Shen and said that the doctor's report that the child was still alive and he would recover soon. Mr. Shen's face was so happy since he had feelings of sympathy for the child. All of these children would be taken to an orphanage, but Mr. Shen was unable to accept that the injured kid would end up in an orphanage. He offered to adopt the child, and he also thanked Mr. Chow for his faith in him. Mr. Chow also bid Mr. Shen farewell. Then he left, his face showing joy because of meeting a good person, that Mr. Shen. At the same time, the police surrounded and arrested the terrible people using children for their own selfish gain.